Welcome, fellow history enthusiasts, to tonight's journey through one of the most fascinating and at times haunting chapters of history, Victorian London, a city of contrasts where industry thrived, yet the poor struggled to survive. We're about to explore a side of the Victorian age that many don't see, focusing not on the opulent grandeur, but on the grim realities of life for the working class. Before we dive deep into the fog and smog of this 19th century metropolis, let's first take a moment to set the stage. Imagine a world where the air you breathe is thick with industrial smoke. The streets are flooded with grime, and survival is an uphill battle. Victorian London wasn't the idealized world of grand palaces and polished streets. It was a city where the poor lived in squalor, diseases spread rapidly, and survival was a small victory each day. Now I know you're here because you're curious, maybe even fascinated by the untold stories of this era. If you enjoy the journey we're about to take together, please take a moment to like, share, and comment below. Let me know what part of this history speaks to you the most, or what you'd like to hear more about as we uncover the dark heart of Victorian London. Your engagement helps bring these stories to life, and I love reading your thoughts. Before we even step into the streets, let's talk about where you'd live if you were a working-class citizen in Victorian London. It's easy to imagine a quaint little cottage by the river or a picturesque townhouse, but the reality, for most, was far from this ideal. You would likely find yourself crammed into a small windowless room, shared with several others, where privacy was a distant dream and cleanliness was a luxury. These places were breeding grounds for disease, with rats scurrying in the shadows and the constant ominous drip of water from the leaky ceilings. As you woke up each morning, you'd be surrounded by the clatter and noise of your neighbors, the creaks of old, tired floorboards, the sound of children scrambling for space to get dressed, the faint smell of rot in the air. The temperature would barely rise above freezing in winter, and if it were raining, you'd be able to hear the drips as they echoed through the ceiling while you lay under your thin wool blanket, desperately trying to stay warm. But none of that would matter much, because the true battle would start when you stepped outside into the streets of Victorian London. The world beyond your door was a battlefield, and every step outside meant risking your life. Imagine stepping out into the thick fog that rolls through London like a living thing. It's not the romantic mist from a foggy novel. No. This fog is deadly, formed by a combination of industrial coal smoke and natural mist. It seeps into your lungs and coats your clothes in a thick, dark grime that's almost impossible to wash out. You can barely see the end of your arm, and the sounds around you are distorted cartwheels rumble in the distance while the occasional cough or shout breaks through the mist. As you navigate the streets, you might stumble over the uneven cobblestones, a result of poor infrastructure in the city's crowded slums. You pass by other people, most of whom are also wrapped in layers of tattered clothes, some shuffling along in the hope of getting a scrap of food. The stench of horse manure, rotten food, and the occasional waft of human waste fills the air as it drifts from the gutters, which are often clogged with garbage. And just when you think it can't get worse, the soot from the industrial factories above falls on your skin and clothes, leaving you covered in a thin layer of black dust that is virtually impossible to wash off. You might be headed to your job in a factory, a dangerous workplace that demands 12 to 16 hours of labor 6 days a week. The factory floor is deafening with noise, the air thick with the fumes of burning coal, and the sharp scent of metal and sweat. And if you work in a coal mine, the conditions are even worse. Your lungs are filled with soot as you dig deep into the earth, risking your life for a meager wage that barely covers the cost of your living. The work is grueling, the hours long, and if you lose a finger or get injured, there's always a child waiting to take your place. For many, this was their reality. There was no escape from the grind. The lack of education meant that children, some as young as 5, were also forced to work. Instead of spending their days playing, they were crawling through chimneys to clean soot or working in factories with machines that could easily maim them. Childhood for the poorest families didn't exist. Instead, children became workers before they were even old enough to understand what life meant. And for women, the struggle was even more pronounced. The Victorian era was a time when women had little to no rights, and their lives were often confined to the home. The work they did, whether as domestic servants or factory workers, was undervalued, and their personal struggles were ignored by the rest of society. Women were expected to do the cleaning, the cooking, the laundry, all while raising children in conditions that were far from safe. And yet, in the midst of this suffering, women managed to carve out a role for themselves. They fought for the right to be heard, to be seen, to live better lives. The suffrage movement was born from these struggles, a movement that would eventually change the course of history. But how did people endure in such miserable conditions? The answer is simple: they had to. Life in Victorian London wasn't just about survival. It was about finding ways to make life bearable. People helped each other. Neighbors shared their food when there was none to spare, and families stuck together even when it meant enduring hardship. There were also moments of joy, even in the darkest of times, laughter, music, and shared stories in the pubs or around the dinner table. Despite the overwhelming odds, people managed to build relationships, raise families, and dream of a better life. As we begin our deep dive into the realities of Victorian London, I want you to keep this one thought in mind. The resilience of the people who lived through this era was nothing short of extraordinary. It wasn't the grand structures or the wealth of the upper class that defined this city. It was the grit and determination of the working class that gave it life. So, if you're ready, let's step into the fog walk down those treacherous streets and uncover the stories of survival, hardship, and hope that shaped one of the world's most iconic cities. And as always, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. I'm curious to hear your thoughts and any questions you might have as we journey together through the dark heart of Victorian London. In the heart of Victorian London, the streets were not the only things that wore the marks of wear and tear. Inside the homes of the city's working poor, there was a quiet, constant struggle against the elements, a daily battle to endure amidst squalor and discomfort. The homes, though sometimes small and cramped, were rarely empty. The walls, sagging with age, seemed to hold the weight of lives lived in close quarters. Families shared their humble spaces, rooms no larger than closets, each one packed with bodies, both living and tired. It was a world where privacy was a luxury, one that few could afford. In the early mornings, children would tumble out of the narrow beds they shared with their siblings, pulling on threadbare clothes as they shuffled to the cold, damp floor. The rooms were often divided by nothing more than the barest of curtains, and as daylight streamed through grimy windows, it revealed a reality that was far from pleasant. These houses, these spaces, were not made for comfort. They were merely places to sleep, eat, and if one was lucky, find respite for a few brief hours before another exhausting day began. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew, a scent that clung to the skin, to the hair, and to the clothes. These were houses where the roofs leaked, where every drop of rain seemed to find its way through the cracks above. The ceiling would groan with the weight of water as it dripped steadily onto the floor. Buckets were placed beneath these leaks, but still the dampness persisted. The walls, forever damp, seemed to absorb the cold, like sponges, pressing it into the bones of anyone who sought shelter within. And it was here, in these places of constant discomfort, that rats and vermin made their homes as well. They scurried across the floorboards at night, foraging for scraps of food left behind. Their beady eyes glinted in the shadows, and their faint skittering sounds filled the silence of the night. The poor had no choice but to live with these companions whose presence became so familiar that the sight of a rat under the bed was not met with alarm, but with resignation. Mold grew on the walls, creeping in dark corners where light rarely reached. The scent of decay lingered in the air, mixing with the musty dampness. Clothes were often hung to dry on simple lines strung across the room, but they never fully dried. They hung perpetually moist, holding the smell of their surroundings. And as the days wore on, the stains from dampness and mildew became as permanent as the peeling wallpaper that clung to the walls. In these homes, the fireplace, though a staple of warmth, offered little comfort. There was no proper heating, and the fireplaces themselves, often nothing more than hollow bricks, with a mock mantle, did little to stave off the biting cold. The families who lived here would sit huddled together, their thin woolen blankets draped over their shoulders. But the chill would not leave. The fire, when it burned, was little more than a trickle of warmth, a fleeting comfort that soon dissipated into the cold, oppressive air. The flames in the hearth would flicker weakly, casting long shadows on the walls. But they could not chase away the dampness that seeped into every corner. These homes were not homes in the truest sense. They were survival spaces built for endurance rather than comfort. For the poor, a place to rest their head at night was all that could be hoped for. And even then, the promise of sleep was often interrupted by the sounds of the street outside, by the occasional scream or shout from a passerby, or by the pitiful cries of a hungry child. But still, they endured. There was little choice but to endure. A family would gather around their small table, if there was one, and eat whatever scraps could be found. In the dim light, the meal would be shared in silence. The food was often stale, the bread hard and brittle. A warm drink was a luxury few could afford. In these humble homes, the simple act of eating was both a necessity and a reminder of the scarcity of comfort. The children, their faces gaunt from hunger, would still smile, for that was the one gift they could afford to give each other, smiles that were free, no matter how much hunger gnawed at their bellies. The days would pass slowly, as each member of the family worked tirelessly to make do with what little they had. The father, often a laborer of some sort, would leave early in the morning, his shoes worn thin from long hours of trudging through the muddy streets. His work might take him to the factories or into the bowels of the city, where the air was thick with smoke and the noise deafening. The mother would tend to the children, cleaning what little could be cleaned, cooking whatever food could be gathered, and doing her best to create some semblance of normalcy in a world that offered little of it. And as night fell, the family would gather once more, each of them finding comfort in the company of others, even if that comfort was fleeting. The homes of Victorian London's working poor were, in a sense, a reflection of their lives, cramped, dark, and cold. And yet, within these small, humble spaces, there was also a sense of resilience, a quiet strength that held them together. Though the conditions were harsh, the family, for all its suffering, was a constant source of support. They faced the world together, united in their struggle to survive, to endure, to make it through another day. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. For in Victorian London, the true battle was not just against the cold, the rats, or the leaks in the roof. It was a battle against despair, a fight to find meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent to the struggles of the poor. And though the homes of these families were far from perfect, they were all they had. And so, they held on. They held on to each other, to the hope of better days, to the belief that somehow they could endure. The fog of Victorian London was no ordinary mist, no soft haze that kissed the ground at dawn. It was a dense, suffocating blanket, heavy and thick, woven from the very air itself. It was a fog that seemed to rise up from the streets and fill the lungs, thickened by the smoke of 1,000 chimneys and factories. The city breathed it in with every step, and as the days wore on, it seemed to settle deeper into every corner. There was no escaping it, for it clung to the city like a heavy, uninvited guest, filling the lungs with each breath and blurring the world into shadows. Coal smoke was the heart of it all, the fuel of industry, the engine that powered the great city. But this same coal, the very thing that helped London grow and thrive, was also its curse. It rose from chimneys and great billowing clouds, dark and foul and mixed with the natural fog that rolled in from the Thames. Together they formed a thick, choking soup that suffocated the city day after day. The skies, already dim from the constant plume of smoke, would darken further as the fog grew more oppressive. And in this fog, breathing became a struggle. It wasn't the gentle exhale of fresh air, but a labored pull, each breath like a slow drag through a damp, clogged pipe. For the people of London, especially, the poor every moment outside became a fight against the thick, suffocating air. It was as if the very city had turned into a living thing, holding its people in a tight, smoky grip. The rich, with their grand houses and insulated lives, could shut themselves away behind their thick walls. But for the working class, the fog was a constant companion, following them from dawn until dusk, inescapable, unforgiving. Children were often the hardest hit. Their small lungs could scarcely handle the heavy air, and as they ran through the streets, their little bodies seemed to weaken under the strain. Their coughs filled the air like the beat of a drum sharp, and frequent, a reminder of the toll the fog took on every breath they drew. The adults too struggled. Their bodies grew weary, their throats raw from coughing, but there was little relief to be found. They would press on their hands, clenched tight around their coats, their heads lowered against the stifling air. To pause was to stop breathing, so they kept moving, step by heavy step, through the choking mist. The fog wasn't just a health hazard, it was a blinding force. It robbed London of its shape, casting the city in a foggy, ethereal glow. The gas lamps, dim and flickering, shone weakly through the haze, offering little help to those who ventured out. In the streets, everything seemed to blend into the gray indistinguishable from one moment to the next. A person walking through the fog would lose track of where they were, disoriented, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones as they stumbled through the gloom. The sound of hooves on wet stone would ring out in the distance, but it was impossible to know from where they came. A carriage might barrel down the street, or a cart loaded with coal might stumble by. But in the thick fog, these dangers were near impossible to spot until it was too late. Those who had to go about their business in the fog, whether for work or for errands, took a great risk with every step. In the mornings, as the fog rolled in with the tide, Londoners would dress quickly, pulling on their heavy coats and scarves, and step into the streets without hesitation. It was simply part of their world. But for the unprepared, the fog could be treacherous. Travelers, strangers to the city, might find themselves lost in it, wandering until the muffled sounds of the street faded into silence. It was a city built on industry, yes, but it was also a city built on risk. And that risk was amplified by the very fog that helped make it so industrialized. For some, the fog was just part of life, a backdrop to their everyday routines. But for others, it was a constant reminder of the dangers lurking in the unseen. The fog was never kind. It was a veil that wrapped the city in a cold, unfeeling embrace. The smell, too, added to the discomfort. The fog carried with it the heavy scent of coal, the sharp stench of burning fuel that clung to everything clothed skin, even the air itself. It was a smell that made the lungs ache, the throat tighten, and the head spin. And as the day wore on, the fog would grow even thicker, mixing with other less pleasant smells. Manure from the horses that carried the carts, the rot of forgotten food in the streets, the sour scent of decay from the overflowing gutters. These smells were all absorbed into the mist, creating a suffocating mixture that followed the people through the streets. The smell was not just unpleasant. It was a reminder of the city's underlying neglect, a constant signal of how the rapid growth of industry had overtaken the health and well-being of the people. There were those who lived amidst the factories, the ones who spent long hours toiling in the very heart of London's industrial engine. For them, the fog was even worse, a stifling presence that made the factories feel like sealed tombs. The workers would breathe in this air all day, inhaling the smoke from the furnaces and the dust from the factories. And when they stepped out into the streets at the end of the day, it was no better. The fog wrapped around them thick and pungent, mixing with the stench of their labor. In the factories, men and women worked shoulder to shoulder in the fog-filled air. Their faces, covered in grime and sweat, seemed indistinguishable from the fog itself. The damp air clung to their skin as if the very environment sought to drain their energy, to pull them down into exhaustion. The constant coughing that filled the factory floor was not just from the workers' own sickness, but from the city itself, a city that had long been too busy to care for its own health. There was no relief from the fog. The city's attempt to control it was as futile as trying to catch the wind in a net. The fog would roll in every day, as if by clockwork, and it would settle on the streets, on the houses, on the workers, and the children. It was the unseen enemy, the one that crept into the body with every breath, that made London's already harsh conditions that much worse. And yet, despite the overwhelming fog, life continued. People went about their daily routines each day, carrying the same weight of discomfort, the same heavy air in their lungs. They had little choice but to live with it, as they had little choice but to live with the grime and the smell, with the noise and the danger. The fog had become a part of life, woven into the very fabric of the city itself. It was as much a part of London as the chimneys and the carts, as the factories and the crowded streets. For the poor, for those who had no choice but to face the fog every day, it was a reminder of the toll that industry had taken on their lives. The fog was the mark of progress, the very symbol of a city that had traded its health for wealth. But even in this suffocating haze, the people of London endured. They coughed, they breathed, they moved forward through the fog, each step a testament to their resilience, even in the face of the choking air that would never seem to let them go. And so, with every passing day, the fog returned, a constant companion, until the city seemed to live in a haze, its edges blurred, its shape obscured. And in the fog, life went on. The first light of morning crept through the grime-coated windows of the small rooms, casting pale, tired beams on the cold, damp floors. The city outside was still enshrouded in fog, its sounds muffled by the heavy blanket that hung over the streets. Within the cramped homes of Victorian London's working poor, however, the world began to stir. In these dimly lit spaces, the day started not with cheer, but with the quiet, mechanical routine of survival. In the corner, a thin figure would rise from a bed shared with too many others. The blanket was tattered no longer, offering much warmth, and the mattress, if one could call it that, was little more than a handful of straw stuffed into a sagging sack. The body ached from the cold, from the hard sleep, from the life lived in constant discomfort. But there was no time for rest. The day was already pressing in, and hunger began its familiar gnawing. The morning struggle began with a simple yet essential task: breakfast. For most, it was a far cry from the hearty meals others might have enjoyed. A crust of bread, hard and stale, would be the first thing sought after. This was no fresh, soft loaf, but the remnants of yesterday's meal, if there was any. The bread was dry, tough, and unyielding, often in such small portions that it seemed more like a token gesture than sustenance. A single slice, perhaps two, would be torn apart barely enough to stave off the hunger, let alone satisfy it. A small bowl of porridge might follow, if the cupboards were not bare. The oats, though filling, were often thin and watery, with little to give them flavor, but the faintest trace of salt. Sometimes the porridge would be eaten without a thought, a duty rather than a delight. This, then, was the breakfast of the working poor, a meal that lacked not only richness, but hope. There were no warm eggs, no hearty strips of bacon to tempt the senses, no sweet jams, or fresh butter to spread on the bread. Those were luxuries far removed from the simple, hard routine of life. The only real comfort was the warmth that came with the food, the feeling of something solid in the stomach to start the day. But even that, in its meager portion, was fleeting. More important, perhaps, than the bread or the porridge was the daily cup of tea. Tea was not a drink of luxury or indulgence. It was a necessity, an anchor in a world that offered little comfort. It was the one constant, the one item in the morning that could be relied upon. The boiling water, though not always clean, would at least kill any lurking impurities, making it a safer choice than drinking the water from the tap. The tea itself, though, often weak and thin, was steeped in the very act of survival. The warmth it offered, even if fleeting, was like a small balm for the tired bones. Tea wasn't a treat, but a lifeline, something to hold on to in the face of the endless grind. The kettle, if it wasn't too dented, would hiss and sing the steam, rising up in small fleeting wisps. A simple empty cup would be set on the table, and a spoonful of tea, perhaps the last of it, would be dropped in. The water, darkened by the tea's strength, would be poured over, filling the room with the faintest scent of leaves, a smell that cut through the dampness. This was a drink that could be shared, something everyone in the house could partake in, no matter how small the cup. It was a common thread, a ritual that linked the scattered moments of the morning together. Though it could not erase the hardships of the day ahead, it could offer a brief moment of warmth in a cold world. For those in desperate circumstances, however, breakfast was far bleaker still. The workhouse, with its cold, unfeeling walls, offered its own kind of sustenance, but it was a far cry from comfort. For the destitute, a ladle of gruel, thin and watery, would be served up as the only meal of the morning. It was nothing more than a bland, soupy mess, often without any flavor, without any substance. Those lucky enough to receive a second helping might find it even less nourishing than the first. The taste, if one could call it that, was a bitter reminder of just how low the food had sunk. It was food by necessity, not by choice. But even this meager portion was often too much for some. It slid down the throat with the ease of something tasteless, something that had no joy, to offer no reason to savor. The stomach, though full for a moment, would soon feel the same emptiness it had felt before. A heavy, gnawing emptiness. No variety greeted the poor in the morning. What was there to eat was all there was, nothing more. No sweet fruit, no creamy porridge laced with honey, no fried potatoes, no warm golden eggs. Just whatever could be scraped together. The meals were not planned or prepared with care. They were cobbled together with the little scraps left behind from the day before. If one was lucky, the bread could be spread with a small dollop of lard. But that was a rare thing. For the most part, there was only the bread, hard, dry, and unyielding. This was a morning in Victorian London for the working poor. No comforts, no pleasures, only the barest necessities. There were no choices to be made, no options to explore. The food was the same as it had always been, just enough to get by and little more. It was the same every day, unchanging, a reminder of the unyielding grind of life. The days passed, each one beginning with the same meager meal, the same struggles, the same absence of anything more. And yet, In this world of scarcity, there was still the act of eating itself, a small, simple thing that for a moment offered a sense of continuity. For all the hardships that the poor of London faced, for all the struggles of the day, they could still gather together around the table, still share the meal, still find the small comfort in being together. Even as the fog pressed against the windows and the work of the day loomed heavy ahead, the simple act of eating in the morning was a reminder of something else: the will to survive, to live even in the face of such deprivation. Each morning, though bleak and quiet, brought with it the hope that the day would bring some small measure of solace, however fleeting. For in the workhouses and the homes of the poor, the act of breaking bread meager, though it was, became a quiet rebellion against the hardships of the world. It was not a meal to be savored, but one to be endured. And in that endurance, there was a strength that could not be measured in food, but in the heart itself. As the tea warmed the body, as the bread settled in the stomach, the morning would unfold as it always did into the day's grind. The city would come to life outside the window, another day of labor, of struggle, of survival. But for a moment at least, there was something to hold on to, something simple and small. And that in a world of such difficulty was enough. The streets of Victorian London were no place for the faint of heart. The moment one stepped beyond the safety of their doorstep, the world turned into a labyrinth of hazards. There were no orderly sidewalks to guide the way, only cracked, uneven cobblestones that rose and fell in a haphazard pattern, like the very bones of the city itself. The path was not paved for comfort or ease. It was a twisted maze where every step required caution, and even the simplest walk could be perilous. The road was a battlefield, and the streets were crowded with all manner of people. The poor, with their heads lowered against the wind, trudged forward, trying to avoid the chaos around them. The wealthy, cloaked in heavy coats and top hats, tried to maintain their dignity amidst the muck, their shoes clicking nervously on the stones as they hurried to their destinations. The flow of bodies seemed endless, always moving, always in a rush, but always tangled in the same miserable dance. But it was not just the people that made the streets dangerous. The horse-drawn carts, which seemed to appear from every direction, were a constant threat. The clop-clop of hooves echoed off the buildings, and the rattle of the wooden carts followed closely behind, filling the air with the creaking of wheels and the shouting of drivers urging their horses forward. These carts, laden with goods, or simply rushing to deliver the next load, barreled through the narrow streets, without regard for the people scattered along the sides. There was no room to retreat, no refuge to be found in the crowds. The carts charged ahead with a kind of reckless inevitability, their drivers shouting curses to clear the way. The horses, sleek and powerful, often could not be slowed in time to avoid those in their path. The clatter of hooves and wheels would echo through the air as a driver swerved to avoid an obstacle, his hands tight on the reins. But it was not always enough. The risk of being caught by one of these carts was ever present. The poor, unprotected, and exposed had to step quickly, constantly, watching for the next cart or carriage that might come careening down the road. Every corner was a gamble. One false move, one misstep, and a person could be knocked to the ground, trampled by the horses, or pinned beneath the heavy wood of the cart. And then there was the gutter, It ran down the center of the streets like a river of filth, always flowing, always collecting the detritus of the city. The stench was unbearable, a vile mixture of rotting food, dead animals, and human waste. The smell clung to the air like a curse, sinking into the clothes of anyone who dared to walk too close. The gutters were not merely a convenience for draining water. They were a reflection of the city's neglect. With no proper sanitation system in place, everything that was discarded ended up here. It was a filthy, chaotic mess that festered beneath the feet of the people, threatening to spill over onto the cobblestones with every step. And yet, despite the smell, the gutters were also alive with movement. Vendors set up their stalls beside them, shouting to be heard over the din of the street. Street urchins darted in and out of the crowd, their small hands reaching into pockets and purses with practiced ease. Pickpockets were everywhere, lurking in the shadows or weaving through the throng, their eyes constantly searching for an opening. It was a city of thieves, and it was a city that demanded constant vigilance. One had to be wary, for to be distracted even for a moment was to risk losing everything. The vendors shouting their wares added to the chaos. They peddled their goods with passion, their voices cutting through the cacophony of the street. Hot pies, fresh pies, get 'em while they're warm. The call of the vendor, punctuated by the clatter of metal and the scraping of wooden carts, was a familiar sound that echoed in the streets of London. The smell of sizzling meat mingled with the stench of the gutters, an odd and unsettling mix that wafted through the air. Some were selling fruits, others their homemade knickknacks. The variety of goods seemed endless, and yet the poverty of the crowd made it clear that few could afford them. Most walked past with empty hands, unable to partake in the fleeting promises of satisfaction that the vendors offered. Among the bustling crowd were the street urchins, children, who had learned to survive on the edge of society. They darted through the gaps between the adults, quick and nimble, their ragged clothes barely clinging to their thin bodies. Their faces, streaked with dirt, were sharp with hunger and desperation. They had no other choice but to steal or beg. There was no room for softness in the streets of London, only the constant push for survival. They would slip into the crowds, their eyes flicking over purses and pockets, looking for any chance to snatch a coin or a scrap of food. As the day wore on, the streets became a blur of motion, with people rushing past one another, trying to find their place in the chaos. The fog still lingering made the task even harder. The city had no mercy on the weary or the weak. It took all the strength one had just to keep moving, just to keep from being lost in the crowd. Every step was a small victory, and every moment of stillness was a risk. The fog had not lifted. It clung to the streets like an old, familiar friend, obscuring vision and dulling sound. The lamplights, though bright, were weak against the thick, swirling mist. It made the world feel small and distant, as if the city itself were held within a dream, half-formed and hazy. The people who walked through it seemed like shadows barely visible through the mist. The sound of their footsteps, the clatter of carts, the cries of children, all of it became muffled, swallowed by the fog that hung low over everything. Even in the daylight, visibility was limited. The fog rendered the streets a labyrinth of indistinct shapes. Buildings loomed like dark shadows, their outlines barely distinguishable from the haze. People passed by without a glance, wrapped in their own thoughts, in their own struggles. It was easy to lose track of where one was, easy to be disoriented in the fog's embrace. One could walk the same stretch of street, passing the same shops and houses, and yet never really know where they were. The fog made it all seem the same, blurred, indistinct a city where nothing stood out, where everything was hidden just beneath the surface. In this mist, the streets of London became more than just a place to walk. They became a maze, dangerous, deceptive, and unyielding. Each turn might lead to something unexpected. A horse-drawn cart barreling down the road, a pickpocket's hand reaching into a coat pocket, or a sudden stumble into a pile of refuse. The city's very design seemed to conspire against those who lived within it, forcing them to fight for every step. As the day began to fade, the streets grew darker, though the fog had not lifted. The gas lamps flickered weakly in the gloom, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The sounds of the street grew louder, the rhythm of life moving forward despite the obstacles. For those who lived here, there was no escape from the danger, from the chaos, from the relentless pressure of the streets. They were caught in a never-ending cycle, one that began with the dawn and stretched into the night. But still, they moved. They survived. For all the risks and all the dangers that lurked in the fog, the people of London carried on step by careful step through the twisting streets that defined their world. And in that quiet persistence, in the face of it all, there was a kind of resilience, a kind of quiet defiance. They walked through the maze day after day, knowing that no matter the hazards, the world would continue to turn. The workday in Victorian London began long before the sun had fully risen. For many, the first sound of morning was not the chirping of birds, but the clang of an iron bell, the summons to rise and face the endless grind that awaited outside. The streets were still shrouded in fog as workers shuffled from their homes, their faces drawn and weary even before the day's labor had begun. The city's factories and coal mines called to them like great beasts hungry for hands that would feed their ever-turning wheels. The factory doors opened early, and the workers filed in, men, women, and children alike, their bodies stiff from the cold of the morning air. The day would stretch long with 12 hours of relentless work ahead. 12 hours of standing, bending, lifting, and moving in monotonous repetition. There was no time for rest. There was no space for respite. The hours were long and unforgiving, stretching out like a dark tunnel that offered no light at the end. The clatter of machines was a constant companion in the factories. The air hummed with the rhythm of industry, a relentless sound that filled the ears and drowned out all else. The workers moved in time with it, their movements mechanical, as though they had become a part of the machines themselves. The air, thick with the dust and soot of the machinery, grew heavy in their lungs. The rooms were poorly ventilated, the light dim and sickly. There was no comfort to be found here, only the harsh reality of labor that left its mark on the body day after day. The conditions were dangerous, though no one seemed to notice or care. There were no safety measures to speak of. Workers often bent over their tasks for hours without pause, risked injury with every movement. The machines, sharp and unforgiving, were like silent beasts, ready to take a hand or foot without warning. Yet the workers continued, their faces set in grim determination. Injuries were common, but they were accepted as part of the job, as inevitable as the long hours. A missing finger, a bruised arm, or worse, a broken limb were simply the cost of earning a wage. There was no time for complaints, no space for sympathy. If a worker fell, someone else would take their place. There were always more to replace those who were lost. And even when the workers were fortunate enough to escape the daily dangers without injury, their wages were pitiful. For all the hours they toiled, for all the exhaustion they endured, they barely earned enough to live on. The pay was meager, often little more than a few pennies at the end of the week. With wages like these, there was no room for comfort. There was barely enough to feed a family or pay for the most basic necessities. And when the wages fell short, as they often did, the workers had no choice but to make do to scrape by on what little they had. A crust of bread, a small portion of gruel, a cup of weak tea. These were the small joys of the working class in Victorian London, things that could be had only by the grace of their labor. For some, the labor came in the form of coal mining. Deep beneath the earth, men and boys worked in the blackness, hacking away at the coal that fed the fires of the city. The mines were dark and damp, their air thick with dust and the smell of sweat. The walls of the tunnels were unstable, and the risk of collapse was ever present. The sound of the pickaxe striking the coal echoed in the narrow claustrophobic tunnels. The work was grueling, and the hours were long, with little time for rest. The miners bent low under the weight of their labor, worked until their bodies could no longer continue, until the weariness in their bones became unbearable. But even worse than the men who labored in the mines were the children who were often sent down into the earth to do the same work. They were small and nimble, able to crawl into tight spaces where the adults could not go. These children, often no older than 8 or 10, were put to work in the mines at an age when they should have been playing and learning. Instead, they spent their days in the dark, hacking away at the coal with their tiny hands, their faces streaked with dust and grime. The work was hard. The air was thick with the dust of the earth, and the danger was ever present. Children were crushed by falling rocks, suffocated by the dust, or caught in the machinery. Yet even as their bodies grew weak, the work continued, for there was no other choice. The families needed the wages, however small they might be. And when the children were not working in the mines, they were often put to work in the factories where the conditions were just as harsh. The machines were dangerous, their teeth like the jaws of a beast, ready to claim whatever came too close. The children, no older than their peers in the mines, worked with the same grim determination, their faces pale from exhaustion, their hands calloused and bleeding. They were too young to understand the risks, too young to know the toll that this work would take on their bodies. All they knew was that they had no choice but to work, for their families depended on them. The life of a child in Victorian London was one of labor, not play. The innocence of childhood was a luxury for the rich. For the poor, childhood was a brief window between birth and work. It was a time to learn how to survive, to learn how to endure. And for many children, that education began in the factories and mines, where they learned the meaning of hard work, of sacrifice, and of suffering. Despite all the hardship, despite the dangers and the exhaustion, the workers of Victorian London continued to toil. The city was built on their labor, and they in turn built the city with their hands, their sweat, and their blood. They worked for a future they might never see, for the promise of something better, something that could be passed on to their children, though that promise often seemed far off. The workers of Victorian London had little choice but to labor. The system was built against them, and the world seemed indifferent to their struggles. The rich, the powerful, and the influential lived lives of comfort, while the poor toiled in the factories, in the mines, and on the streets. The workers had no rights, no voice, and no power. They were in many ways invisible, their suffering ignored by those who had the privilege of turning away. But still, they worked. The sound of their labor, the hum of the factories, the clatter of the carts filled the air day after day. They worked because they had no other choice, because the city demanded it, because their families depended on them. They worked because they could not afford to stop, because if they did, they would be lost. The workers of Victorian London endured, not because they were strong, but because they had no other choice but to survive. In the heart of Victorian London childhood was not a time for play. It was a brief, fleeting moment between birth and labor. A time when children learned quickly that survival was the only goal. Their small bodies were pressed into service, their tiny hands forced to work in places where even the adults could scarcely endure. The streets were filled with them children, no older than 10 or 12, already bearing the weight of responsibility far too great for their years. Among the most wretched of these young laborers were the chimney sweeps. These poor children, often no more than 6 or 7, were sent up chimneys that no grown man could fit into. The work was brutal and the risk was great. They were small enough to squeeze into the narrow, soot-choked flues crawling through the dark spaces with no light to guide them. The air was thick with dust, the walls sharp with the grit of years of accumulated soot. And as they made their way up inch by inch, their lungs filled with the foul blackness of the chimneys. Some would get stuck, their bodies wedged tight, and if they could not be pulled free, they would suffocate in the darkness. The risk of injury was constant. The sharp edges of the flue would tear at their skin, leaving cuts and bruises all over their bodies. Some would be burned by the heat. Others would suffer from the constant coughing and wheezing that came with inhaling the toxic air. But the children had no choice. Their small hands, covered in soot and dirt, were the only tools they had to make a living. The work was dangerous, yes, but for the poor, it was the only way to survive. For those children who did not crawl through chimneys, the factories offered no better fate. The factories were crowded with young workers, their small bodies bent over the machines, their hands moving quickly, relentlessly through the hours. Children were employed to do the work that no one else wanted. They worked as much as adults, and sometimes more. Their tasks were simple but exhausting. Picking up coal, moving materials, working the machines that spun and whirred around them. The noise was deafening, the air filled with dust and smoke. It was a life of ceaseless toil, where every minute was a fight to keep up with the machines. These young workers did not know what it was to rest. Their days were long, often stretching into 12 or more hours, and the only reprieve came when the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a pale light over the crowded streets. But even then, they had no time to play. The factories did not close for the children to go home. They simply worked in shifts, each one as grueling as the last. The work was physically demanding, and the conditions were unforgiving. The machines, cold and mechanical, were unforgiving as well, with injuries common. A slip of the hand could cost a finger or worse, and yet there was no other option. The children could not afford to stop. The lives of these young workers were a constant blur of movement, their bodies growing weaker with each passing day. Their minds, once bright with the promise of childhood, began to fade beneath the weight of the work. For these children, there was no room for education. There were no books to read, no lessons to be learned. The schools, when they existed at all, were too expensive for the families of the working poor. Instead of sitting in classrooms, the children learned their lessons in the factories, the chimneys, and the streets. They learned the value of hard labor, the necessity of survival, and the grim truth that their futures would be no different from their parents. This lack of education was not just an absence of knowledge, it was a loss of opportunity. These children grew up with no understanding of what could lie beyond the factory or the coal mines. They had no access to the worlds of literature, of ideas, of dreams. They were born into a system that demanded their labor, and that was all they could know. The world outside of their toil was as distant to them as a dream that could never be reached. In the midst of all this, childhood itself was stolen. These children, though small in stature, carried burdens far too heavy for their years. They were forced to grow up before their time, their innocence taken by the necessity of labor. There was no room for play, no time for games. The simple joys of childhood, laughing with friends, running through the streets, or dreaming of the future, were luxuries these children could not afford. Survival was their only concern, and it overshadowed everything else. The loss of innocence was not a singular event. It was gradual, like the erosion of the shoreline by a slow, steady tide. Each day, each hour, wore away at the sweetness of childhood until there was nothing left but the constant ache of fatigue and the quiet understanding that the life they lived was all they could expect. They did not know what it was to dream, for their future was already determined by the factories and the chimneys. They were not given the time or the space to wonder what might lie beyond their immediate world, for they were too busy surviving. Yet despite all of this, the children endured. They carried on with their work, their bodies growing weaker, their faces growing older with each passing day. And in the small spaces between the hours of labor, when the machines stopped whirring and the coal fires burned low, they would sometimes find moments to be children once more. They would gather together in the alleys or the dark corners of the factories, laughing quietly at jokes only they understood. These brief moments of joy, though fleeting, were the last remnants of their childhood. But even they were tinged with sadness, for the reality of their lives never truly left them. They were always waiting for the next shift, the next task, the next demand that would keep them moving, keep them working, keep them trapped in the cycle that had no end. For these children, there was no escape from the work that defined their lives. There was no way to outrun the factories, the mines, the chimneys, or the grinding poverty that ensured they would live and die in the same way. Their bodies grew tired, their minds grew dull, and their spirits were worn thin by the constant demands of survival. But even in the face of it all, they kept moving, kept working, kept breathing. They were the forgotten children of Victorian London, their voices drowned out by the machines they fed and the systems that profited from their labor. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the factories fell silent and the city slept beneath the weight of the fog, these children, their faces streaked with soot, would dream not of escape, but of rest. A simple rest, where they could stop working, stop moving, and simply sleep. It was a dream that few would ever see fulfilled, but it was the only dream they had left. In the suffocating haze of Victorian London, where the streets teemed with industry and the homes of the poor pressed tightly together, illness was as much a part of life as the factory wheels and coal dust. It was a quiet, insidious presence creeping through the city like the fog itself. It clung to the air, to the bodies, and to the hearts of those who could least afford it. In the overcrowded slums, where people lived in close quarters, disease spread like wildfire, fueled by the squalid conditions that defined their lives. Among the most feared of these diseases was tuberculosis, known in those days as consumption. It was a slow, relentless sickness that hollowed out its victims, leaving them pale and weak, their bodies wasting away as they coughed and coughed, expelling blood and phlegm with every breath. It was a disease that thrived in the cramped, unsanitary living conditions that were the reality for so many. The damp, poorly ventilated rooms, the shared beds, the constant exposure to cold and filth. These were the perfect breeding grounds for the deadly bacteria that spread consumption from one person to another. The disease was spread not just through the air, but through the touch of hands, the sharing of food, the everyday interactions between people living too close together. The poor had little choice but to live in such conditions, and so they paid the price with their health. The coughing was a constant sound in the narrow streets, a sound that was almost indistinguishable from the noise of the city itself. Those who fell ill with tuberculosis were often left to suffer in silence, their bodies too weak to fight the disease, and their families too poor to seek the help that might save them. As consumption ravaged the lungs, it also seemed to ravage the spirit. Those who contracted it grew weary with each passing day. Their once vibrant bodies became frail and thin, their faces hollow, their eyes dull with fever. In the end, they could not escape it. The disease took its toll slowly, like the turning of a clock each tick, bringing the victim closer to death. And yet, even as death loomed closer, life had to go on. The sick were cared for by their families, but often there was little they could do beyond offering comfort, which in the face of such a disease felt as useless as a whisper against a roaring storm. But tuberculosis was not the only enemy that lurked in the dark corners of the city. Cholera, too, was a silent killer that claimed many lives in the grimy streets. The disease spread like wildfire, fueled by the polluted water that ran through the city's open gutters. The water, tainted with human waste and rotting food, was all that the poor had to drink, to wash, and to cook with. There was no sanitation, no clean running water in the homes of the working class. The rivers, once vital sources of life, had become open sewers, carrying filth and disease into the very heart of the city. Cholera arrived suddenly like a thunderstorm, and when it came, it swept through the population with terrifying speed. Those who drank from the contaminated water soon found themselves violently ill, racked with pain, vomiting, and suffering from severe diarrhea. The disease could kill in a matter of hours, leaving nothing behind but a body that had been drained of life. The streets were filled with the sounds of suffering, coughing, groaning, the wailing of those who had lost loved ones. In the wake of cholera, entire families could be wiped out, leaving only the echoes of their existence behind. There was little that could be done to stop the spread of cholera. The poor had no means to protect themselves from the contaminated water, and the authorities, though, aware of the disease's presence, did little to address the root cause. Water pumps were shut down, but the damage had already been done. The disease had spread too far too quickly. By the time a cholera outbreak was noticed, it was often too late to contain, and so the cycle repeated itself again and again as the bodies of the dead were carted away and the living struggled to survive. For those who fell ill, the help available was meager at best. Doctors, though they existed, were few and far between. The medical profession was still in its infancy, and treatments were often ineffective, if not downright dangerous. The knowledge of disease was limited, and doctors relied on rudimentary methods that were as likely to harm as to heal. Bloodletting, for example, was a common practice used to balance the body's humors, but it did little to cure the diseases that ravaged the population. In fact, it often weakened the patient, further hastening their death. Medicines, too, were crude concoctions derived from plants or minerals with little understanding of how they worked, or whether they worked at all. The poor had no choice but to turn to these doctors, for there were no other options. They could not afford the luxury of rest or comfort. Instead, they waited for whatever relief the doctor might offer, knowing that it was no guarantee of survival. In many cases, they were left to suffer alone, their illnesses ignored by those in power, who were too concerned with the workings of industry to address the health crisis that was spreading through the working-class neighborhoods. But the people of Victorian London, in their desperation, often turned to other remedies. Herbal concoctions passed down through generations became a lifeline for many who had no other recourse. These remedies, though largely ineffective in curing the diseases that plagued them, offered a sense of control. The herbalists, often women who lived in the poorer districts, mixed roots, leaves, and bark to create teas, poultices, and tinctures. They would claim to cure all manner of ailments from fever to cough, and some of these remedies provided temporary relief. A cup of chamomile tea steeped with honey might ease a sore throat, or a simple herbal balm might soothe aching muscles. But for the diseases like tuberculosis and cholera, these remedies were powerless. They offered no cure, only the comfort of tradition. The herbalists knew this well. They did not promise miracles, but they offered what they could, what had been passed down to them from those who had lived and died before them. They too were trapped in a world where illness was ever present, where suffering was as inevitable as the daily grind of work. And so, the people of Victorian London lived in a world where disease was as much a part of life as the noise of the factories, the clatter of carts on cobblestone streets, and the fog that hung in the air. Illnesses came and went, taking their toll on the bodies of the poor, and yet life carried on. It was a life of struggle, of endurance, of survival. The people lived not for the hope of health, but for the hope of making it through another day. The doctors might offer little help, and the herbalists might provide only temporary relief. But still, the people continued to fight their bodies battered by disease, their spirits unbroken. In the end, it was not just the sickness that defined the people of Victorian London, but their ability to endure it. They lived in a world that demanded their strength, their resilience, and their patience. And despite the illnesses, despite the suffering, they carried on. In Victorian London, the simple act of drinking water was a gamble. The rivers and wells that fed the city's thirst were tainted, poisoned by the very life they supported. The Thames, once a great river of commerce, had become a dark, sluggish stream, clogged with the refuse of industry and human waste. The streets, too, had their own gutters, open channels that carried not just rainwater, but the filth of the city, discarded food, rotting meat, and the most dreadful of all human waste. This was the water that the poor drank for it, was the only water they could access. The wealthy had wells of their own drawn from deeper, cleaner sources. But for the masses, there was no choice but to make do with what was available. It was a cruel irony that in a city of such size and wealth, clean water was in such short supply. The pipes that were meant to carry fresh, potable water were few and far between. The majority of Londoners drew their water from public pumps, which stood in the streets like silent sentinels. These pumps were shared by dozens of families, each of them waiting their turn. Each of them hoping the water was not as contaminated as it often was. The very water that was supposed to sustain life instead became a silent killer, as unseen bacteria thrived in the stagnant pools. Cholera was the worst of these killers, spreading through the communities like wildfire, carried by the very water that the people relied upon. The disease arrived suddenly, with no warning, taking hold of its victims with terrifying speed. Once it took root in the body, it ravaged with relentless force. The stomach would be torn apart by vomiting the intestines racked with pain and diarrhea, leaving the victim weak and parched. Dehydrated and hollowed out, they would quickly slip into a state of unconsciousness. The poor, already weakened by malnutrition and grueling labor, were especially vulnerable. And once the disease spread through a neighborhood, it seemed impossible to stop. In the crowded slums, the effects were felt hardest. Families lived in close quarters, often sharing rooms with others in even worse conditions. The walls were thin, the air stale with the dampness of overcrowding, and there was no space to avoid the disease once it entered. A single infected person could contaminate the water for an entire neighborhood, and from there, the disease would spread like wildfire, taking one person after another. By the time the symptoms became obvious, it was often too late. The poor had no money for doctors, and the city had no proper infrastructure to deal with the crisis. Cholera outbreaks became a regular event as the unsanitary water continued to carry the disease from one poor district to the next. The city's lack of a clean water infrastructure made matters worse. There were no proper waste management systems, no plumbing in the majority of homes, and no sewers to carry away the filth. Instead, the streets became open sewers, the gutters running with the refuse of human life. The waste piled up unseen, but ever present, feeding the bacteria that festered in the stagnant water. The streets, once bustling with people, became an invisible battlefield, the illness lurking beneath the surface. The lack of sanitation created a vicious cycle. Disease spread quickly, but it could not be stopped without proper infrastructure. The poor were left to suffer, while the wealthier parts of the city remained relatively untouched by the worst effects of the crisis. The wealth gap, already wide, seemed insurmountable in the face of the cholera outbreaks. The poor, with their homes crammed into tenements and alleyways, had little choice but to drink from the contaminated pumps. It was a simple fact of life. If they were thirsty, they drank. The alternative was worse dehydration, weakness, and the slow decline of a body starved for water. Sometimes, if they were fortunate, they would boil the water first. Boiling was the only way to kill the bacteria, but even that was a luxury few could afford. The process required fuel, which was expensive and scarce, and time, which was even more precious in the lives of the working poor. The warmth of the boiling water, the faint scent of steam rising from the pot, was a temporary reprieve from the grim reality of the day. But it was not enough to protect them from the diseases that lingered in every drop. In many homes, there were no means to boil water. A small pot over a fire might have been enough to prepare a meal, but it was rarely enough to purify the water. The smell of stale, contaminated water lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of the coal fires that burned to keep the homes warm and the odors of food that had been left too long. The very air itself seemed to carry the threat of illness, its dampness filling the lungs of all who breathed it in. It was as if the city itself conspired against its people, filling them with the toxins that would eventually bring them to their knees. And yet, the poor had little choice but to endure. They could not afford to move to cleaner districts where the wealthy lived in isolation from the struggles of the common people. They could not escape the tainted water, the polluted air, or the filthy streets. They could only continue to drink from the pumps, bathe in the contaminated water, and hope, though they knew it was a fragile hope, that somehow they would be spared from the cholera, from the typhoid, from the diseases that ravaged their communities. As the years passed, some attempts were made to address the water crisis. The government began to implement some measures attempting to build sewers and clean water systems, but these efforts were slow, and the poor continued to suffer. The cholera outbreaks became more frequent, more deadly, as the city's population grew, and the lack of sanitation became even more dire. It wasn't until much later, when the disease had claimed thousands of lives, that the authorities took more serious action, finally recognizing the link between contaminated water and the spread of illness. But for many, the damage had already been done. The years of neglect and inaction had taken their toll, and the poor were left to pick up the pieces of a city that had never cared for them. In the end, the water crisis was a stark reminder of the inequality that ran through the veins of Victorian London. The rich could shield themselves from the dangers of contaminated water with their private wells and their clean, well-maintained homes. But for the poor, the risk of disease was an ever-present threat, lurking just beneath the surface of every sip of water, every breath of air, every step through the streets. And in that relentless struggle to survive, they endured their lives marked by the very water that was supposed to sustain them. In the shadowed corners of Victorian London, where the fog thickened like a smothering blanket, and the streets were filled with the endless shuffle of weary feet, crime became an inescapable part of life. For the poor, For those who had nothing to lose, survival often meant turning to the shadows, where the laws of morality were bent to the harsh realities of hunger and desperation. The streets themselves, slick with moisture and darkened by the gloom, were breeding grounds for crime, where every corner hid a new danger, a new threat. Pickpockets were a common sight, their hands quick and practiced, slipping into the pockets of the unsuspecting with a deftness that was almost unnoticed. Children, small and nimble, learned early to pickpocket, moving through the crowded streets with eyes sharp for any opening. They would sidle up to the well-dressed men and women who passed by, and with a swift motion, they would lift a coin purse or a handkerchief, disappearing into the throng before the victim even realized what had happened. For these children, it was simply part of the rhythm of the day, an art they had honed to perfection in the streets where survival depended on their ability to go unnoticed. The risk of theft was ever present. Even in daylight, the streets were not safe. But at night, when the fog rolled in thicker and the gas lamps cast weak flickering light, the dangers of the city grew more pronounced. The poor, especially those who worked late hours or found themselves on the streets after dark, were vulnerable. The darkened alleys, which seemed to stretch on forever, became hiding places for criminals looking for easy targets. Robbers would lurk in the shadows, their eyes glinting with malice as they waited for a passerby to wander too close. A single moment of distraction, a glance at the ground, and the victim would feel a rough hand clutching at their belongings, their heart racing with the sudden sharp fear of loss. And it was not just petty thieves who haunted the streets of London. Organized crime rings had begun to flourish, operating like secret societies with their own code of conduct. These gangs had their own hierarchy, their own leaders, and their own territories. They ran their businesses with a ruthless efficiency, dealing in stolen goods, blackmail, and extortion. The underworld of London was vast, stretching beneath the surface of the city like a dark river, flowing with all manner of illegal activity. For the poor, joining such a gang might be a ticket to a better life, a way to climb out of the gutter and into the fleeting world of power that the gangs offered. The gangs operated with the same cold logic as the factories. The strong preyed on the weak, the cunning outwitted the trusting, and the law was a distant thing that had no bearing on their lives. If you were unfortunate enough to cross paths with these criminals, your fate was sealed. The police, though present in the streets, were often too underpaid and overworked to offer much protection. They were often in the pockets of the very criminals they were meant to apprehend, leaving the poor to fend for themselves. The streets were a lawless world where the only justice that existed was the one you could take with your own hands. Yet perhaps the most disturbing crime to emerge in this desperate city was the rise of body snatchers. In a world where hunger and disease were ever present, where people lived and died in the blink of an eye, the bodies of the dead were a valuable commodity. Medical schools desperate for cadavers to study turned to grave robbing as a means of supplying their needs. The body snatchers, or resurrection men, as they were known, would prowl graveyards looking for freshly buried corpses ready to be exhumed for a price. The families of the dead, who had barely enough to feed themselves, could do little to stop them. The bodies were taken sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes in broad daylight, and sold to the highest bidder. The process was as grim as it was profitable. The resurrection men worked quickly, knowing that the value of a body diminished the longer it stayed in the ground. The stolen corpses were often sold to medical schools, where students would study them, dissecting them to understand the mysteries of the human body. For those involved in the trade, it was a lucrative business, one that could bring in more money than many could hope to earn in a year of honest work. It was a grotesque reality in a city where life was cheap and death offered the only escape. The body snatchers were a terrifying presence in the city, their shadowy figures moving through the graveyards and alleyways, their eyes always searching for the next opportunity. But the crime was not without its own dangers. The body snatchers were hunted by the authorities, and many were caught and punished for their crimes. However, the demand for bodies was so high that the trade continued, and the resurrection men remained a fixture in the underworld of London. For the poor, these crimes were not just acts of desperation, they were acts of survival. The law, though present in the streets, offered little protection for those who had nothing. If you were poor in Victorian London, the odds were stacked against you. The factories, the mines, and the streets had already taken so much from you. For many, turning to crime was the only way to survive. Whether through petty theft, robbery, or the more sinister trades that flourished in the city's dark corners, crime became a necessary evil in a world where survival was the ultimate goal. The criminals of Victorian London were not born into crime. They were shaped by the harshness of their world, by the endless poverty, and the ever-present threat of death. For them, crime was not a choice, but a way of life. It was a means to an end, a way to carve out a small piece of power in a city that had none to spare. And for those who lived in the shadows, it was a harsh reminder of the divide that separated the rich from the poor, the divide between those who had the luxury of a decent life and those who had to fight tooth and nail just to survive. In the fog and darkness of London's streets, crime was not just a way to survive, it was a way to exist. And for those who lived in the city's grim underbelly, it was the only path left to them. In the grim world of Victorian London, women were often unseen, their labor unnoticed, and their struggles unspoken. The city, alive with the noise of industry and the bustle of the streets, seemed to hum with energy. But much of that energy was quietly powered by women whose work went largely unacknowledged. Their days, though long and full, were spent in silence, their bodies weary from labor, and their spirits often broken by the weight of their responsibilities. Women of the working class had few choices, and those they had were fraught with hardship. Most found work in domestic service as servants in the grand houses of the rich. But these positions, though seemingly secure, came with their own burdens. Domestic servants were required to rise before dawn and work well into the evening, cleaning, cooking, washing, and tending to the needs of their employers. They lived in the shadows of the homes they served, often relegated to small, cramped rooms in the attic or basement, where they could not enjoy the comforts of the families they worked for. The work was physically demanding, and the hours were long, but the wages were meager, barely enough to survive. They were given no rest, no respite, and certainly no recognition. For many women, life in domestic service was a life of constant servitude. They were at the beck and call of their employers, expected to be silent, efficient, and obedient. The work was grueling, the pay insufficient, and the conditions unsanitary. Women often worked in kitchens filled with the smoke and heat of open fires cleaning pots and pans that were left in disarray, washing laundry that was never ending. The air in the houses they served was thick with dust, and the floors were often damp with the same foul smell that filled the streets of the city. Despite their endless work, they were rarely thanked. The privilege of rest, of warmth, of food, these were luxuries reserved for those who lived above them. In the factories, things were no better. Women, like men, were pressed into service to meet the demands of the growing industrial machine. They worked in the same factories shoulder to shoulder with men and children operating machines that were dangerous and exhausting. Their fingers, worn and calloused from the constant motion of the machines, worked tirelessly producing goods that would bring little reward to their hands. The hours were the same as in domestic service, 12 or more hours a day, with no time for rest, no time for a reprieve. The work was dehumanizing, reducing them to little more than extensions of the machines they operated. Their labor was no less vital than that of the men, yet their wages were always less, their contributions always overlooked. In these factories and laundries, women were part of the invisible workforce that kept the city moving, that kept the wheels of industry turning. They were the ones who kept the homes of the rich clean and orderly, who produced the goods that were sold in the market, who washed the clothes of the workers. And yet, they were often treated as invisible, as if their labor was of little consequence. Their work was seen as less valuable, less significant, even though it was the foundation on which the city's economy rested. In their private lives, the situation was no better. Women in Victorian London had few rights of their own. The legal system treated them as the property of their husbands or fathers, and they were dependent on these men for their livelihoods. A married woman had no right to own property or manage her own money. She could not sign contracts or make decisions about her own life without her husband's consent. In many ways, she was a legal non-entity, her identity subsumed by that of the man who controlled her. For unmarried women, the options were just as limited. They were often dependent on their fathers or brothers, and their roles in society were defined by their relationships to men, not by their own ambitions or desires. But even in this system, women were expected to bear the brunt of domestic labor. The housewife's duties were endless, a never-ceasing cycle of cooking, cleaning, and raising children. Though the house was meant to be a place of rest for many women, it was nothing more than another form of servitude. The children, though a source of love, were also a heavy burden. They needed constant care, constant attention. The work of raising children, often in unsanitary conditions, was physically exhausting. The lack of modern conveniences meant that the work of maintaining a household fell solely on the wife and mother. There were no washing machines, no dishwashers, no electric lights. The work was done by hand from the first light of morning until the last embers of the fire died down at night. And then there was the constant threat of abuse. Women in Victorian London were often at the mercy of their employers, their husbands, or the men they encountered on the street. The sexual harassment they endured was in many ways part of the fabric of society. It was expected that women would submit to the will of men, that they would endure whatever hardships were thrown their way. In the factories, they were vulnerable to the lecherous advances of supervisors whose power over them was unchecked. In the homes they served, they were often subjected to the whims of their employers, who treated them as little more than servants, with no regard for their dignity or well-being. Even in the streets, the threat of abuse loomed large. The dark alleys and the quiet corners of the city were places where women could easily be taken advantage of, where their voices would be silenced and their struggles ignored. The police, though they existed to protect the citizens, were often indifferent to the plight of women. They were seen as second-class citizens, their complaints and cries for help brushed aside by those in power. Despite all of this, women in Victorian London endured. They worked in silence behind the scenes, their labor, the hidden force that kept the city running. They raised families, kept homes, and managed the impossible task of surviving in a world that saw them as little more than tools for labor. They endured the physical toll of their work, the emotional toll of their lives, and the constant threat of abuse. Yet they endured. They kept the city alive. They kept their families alive. And in doing so, they built the foundation of the society that would one day rise up and recognize their worth. Though their names were rarely spoken and their stories often forgotten, the women of Victorian London were the invisible workers who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. And though their struggles were hard, their spirits were not easily broken. In the quiet corners of the city, in the darkened rooms of the factories and homes, they persisted. They made the world turn even when the world refused to see them. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the fog thickened, the city of London took on a different shape, one more sinister and uncertain. The streets, once bustling with the noise of industry and commerce, became dark and uninviting. The fog, which hung like a shroud over the city, deepened with the evening swallowing the gas lamps' flickering light and blurring the world into shadows. The cobblestones slick from the mist grew treacherous to navigate. In these darkened streets, the air felt heavy thick with the promise of danger. At night, London's heart seemed to beat a little slower, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The familiar sounds of the day carriages clattering on stone, the voices of children playing the clink of money in the markets faded, leaving behind only the eerie quiet of the night. And in that silence, the dangers that lurked in the shadows came to life. Without the safety of daylight, without the busy hum of the city, the streets became a haven for those who thrived in the dark. The criminals, the thieves, and those whose hands were stained with the marks of vice took control. They moved silently like ghosts through the fog, knowing that the city could not and would not protect its most vulnerable when the night came. The lack of proper street lighting made it all too easy for criminals to hide their actions. The gas lamps, though they cast dim pools of light along the roads, were few and far between, and often sputtered and flickered out of life. Where the light failed, the fog stepped in thick and heavy to obscure what could have been seen. A passerby might walk for minutes in a dark alley, unaware of the danger just steps away. And there, in those shadowed corners, men with ill intentions waited, hoping for the right moment to strike. Robbery was common in these hours, and assaults more so. The city's crime rate rose with the setting sun, for when the daylight faded, the police force, already overwhelmed by the chaos of the day, was stretched thin. They could not patrol every street, could not guard every corner. Lawlessness crept in with the dark, and many simply walked with a heightened sense of fear, knowing that a false step could mean a robbery or worse. For women, the dangers were particularly dire. The streets of London, already a treacherous place for those without means of protection, became even more so once nightfall arrived. To walk alone after dusk was to court danger. There were no safe paths, no guarantees that a woman could make it home without being accosted. Robbery, assault, and worse were a constant threat. Women dressed in their heavy shawls and skirts walked with heads lowered, their hands clutching their bags or baskets close to their bodies. They hurried to their destinations looking over their shoulders more often than they would have in the light of day, scanning the fog for shadows that did not belong. A woman's vulnerability was heightened in the night. The city seemed to swallow up her presence, leaving her exposed to those who preyed on the weak. For many, walking the streets at night was not just a matter of reaching home, but of surviving the journey. It was an endless game of vigilance. They had no choice but to keep moving, to keep their feet light and their senses sharp. To pause, to stand still, was to become an easy target. And yet, there was nowhere to hide, no refuge to turn to. The tenements and alleyways seemed to close in on themselves, leaving nowhere to escape the suffocating darkness. But it wasn't just the criminals and the predators that made the night dangerous. The homes themselves, with their poorly maintained chimneys and rickety roofs, posed their own set of risks. As night settled in, the warmth from the hearth became a necessity, a small comfort amidst the cold, damp air of the city. But the very warmth that brought comfort also brought danger. Chimneys old and cracked from years of use could catch fire at any moment. The smoke, which should have been carried up and out of the home, might instead spill into the room, filling the air with choking fumes. Many families lived in constant fear of the fire that might start in the dead of night when the household was asleep unaware. The threat of fire was ever present. In these cramped spaces, where families huddled together for warmth, a fire in the hearth was both a blessing and a curse. The hearth was not a safe retreat from the cold, but a potential source of death. A single spark could catch the furniture alight, or worse, ignite the very walls. The soot that gathered in the chimneys added to the risk, a constant reminder that the fire was never truly under control. And so families slept lightly, their rest filled with the uneasy awareness that fire could break out at any moment. The nights in London were filled with the soft crackling of the fire and the muffled sounds of people shifting in their sleep. But underneath it all, there was a constant hum of anxiety. The homes were poorly insulated, and the cold seeped through the cracks in the walls, leaving everyone restless. The threat of fire and the danger of assault hung over the people, and the fog outside seemed to creep into their hearts, suffocating them even as they tried to find sleep. Though the night was full of its own unique dangers, the people of London carried on. They had no choice but to endure. The streets were dark, but they walked them with their heads low and their feet quick. The criminals were many, but they were not all powerful. The fear of assault, of robbery, could not paralyze the people. They had to go on to move forward to survive the endless night. The threat of fire in the hearth was a constant, but it was a risk they had learned to live with. The city might be dark and dangerous, but the people, in their own quiet way, fought against it. They carried on despite the fear, despite the danger. For in a city that never slept, there was no room for stopping, no time to rest. The night, though full of its own threats, was a necessary part of the rhythm of London. It was a rhythm that must be followed, a rhythm of survival. And though it was dangerous, though it was uncertain, the people moved through it step by careful step, knowing that the morning, with its own set of challenges, would eventually come. Amid the thick fog and the ceaseless churn of industry, there was buried beneath the weight of daily toil a quiet but persistent yearning for something better. For those who spent their days in factories, mines, and narrow tenements, the struggle to survive was constant, and yet deep in their hearts there flickered a fragile hope. Hope that life could improve, that their children might know a world less harsh, and that the oppressive weight of poverty might one day be lifted. The workers, many of them already worn thin by the hours spent laboring in dark, dangerous spaces, began to stir. They began to gather to speak of their frustrations and their desires for change. What they sought was simple, better working conditions, fair wages, and a life not spent in constant fear of injury or illness. The hours were long, 12, sometimes even more, and the wages barely enough to keep a family fed, let alone provide for the future. But as the years wore on, something shifted in the hearts of the working class. A spark of unity kindled, and they realized that together they could demand change. It began with small gatherings, quiet conversations between fellow workers in the corners of the factory floors or along the cobbled streets during brief moments of rest. And as the word spread, the workers began to organize. They spoke of strikes of walking away from the machines, from the coal, from the ovens and looms that had become their prisons. Their voices grew louder, their resolve stronger. They knew that by standing together, they could not only demand better pay, but also the respect that had long been denied them. The cries for justice rang through the streets, and soon the quiet stirrings of discontent turned into full-blown strikes. The factory owners, with their wealth and power, fought against the workers' demands. The strikes were met with resistance, sometimes violent, but the workers were unyielding. They stood in the streets, their bodies weary, but their voices clear, pushing for a better life. In their hearts, they knew the road would not be easy. But the strike was more than just an act of defiance. It was a declaration of hope, a cry for dignity in the face of years of oppression. And though their efforts were met with opposition, there was something undeniable about the workers' unity. They had begun to understand their own power. Beyond the strikes, the workers of London began to form their own networks of support. Despite the crushing weight of their own burdens, many sought ways to help one another, to make life just a little more bearable for those who had nothing. Charities began to rise from the very communities that were most impoverished. The idea of mutual aid spread among the poorest neighborhoods. Families who often had nothing more than a few coins to their name would share what little they had. If a neighbor fell ill and could no longer work, others would step in offering food, firewood, or whatever they could spare. It was not much, but in a world where survival often depended on such gestures, it was everything. In these small acts of kindness, the people of London found their strength. They knew that they were not alone, even in the darkest hours. In the absence of government aid, the people became their own lifeline. They shared what little food they had, and when one household fell on hard times, others would rally together. It was through these collective efforts that survival became possible. The strength of the community The quiet solidarity between neighbors became a thread that held the fragile fabric of life together. And still, despite all the hardship, the hope endured. It was a flickering light in the face of relentless adversity, a quiet promise that there could be something better, even if it was only a dream. The workers' strikes, the mutual aid societies, the acts of kindness, these were not just reactions to hardship, but expressions of something deeper, a desire for change. The people knew that they were caught in a system that sought to grind them down, but they also knew that change, however small, was possible. Every act of solidarity, every piece of bread shared, every moment of resistance brought them closer to a world where their efforts would not be in vain. Even in the bleakest moments, when the weight of the world seemed unbearable, the people of London found ways to move forward. They carried the weight of their dreams with them, tucked into the folds of their tattered coats, and though they could not see the end of the road, they kept walking. The struggle for a better life did not end with a single strike or a single gesture. It was an ongoing journey, one that stretched on through the years, fueled by the quiet hope that one day the world would change. In the factories, the streets, and the tenements, the drive to survive became intertwined with the drive to improve, to reach for something beyond the grinding cycle of work and struggle. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, the workers, the poor, the forgotten of London held on to their hope that their children would live in a world that was kinder, a world where their labor was not exploited, where they were not invisible. And so, the people of Victorian London, despite their poverty, despite their exhaustion, continued to reach for a better life. It was not always clear what that life would look like, nor how it would come to pass. But they carried their hope with them, a quiet force that, like the city itself, refused to be extinguished. Surviving Victorian London was no small feat. The daily challenges faced by its residents, poverty, disease, and unsafe working conditions created an unrelenting storm, one that constantly tested the limits of human endurance. Yet amid the soot, smog, and suffering that draped the city, there was a glimmer of something more. Beneath the weight of industry and the shadows cast by the towering buildings, the resilience of the people shone through in the most extraordinary ways. It was not the grand, sweeping victories of history that defined the lives of the working class, but rather the quiet, unwavering perseverance that carried them from one day to the next. The lives of the poor in Victorian London were shaped by hardship. Their days were filled with endless labor, their nights haunted by fears of disease, crime, and fire. Yet they carried on. They woke each morning to face the unyielding rhythm of the factory floor, the factory's grinding gears, and the piercing, clanging sounds of the machines. They crawled into narrow chimneys to scrub soot, their small bodies fitting into spaces that no adult could manage. They worked in overcrowded laundries and kitchens, their bodies bent and their hands calloused. Each day, they fought against the very elements of life, disease, hunger, and exhaustion that threatened to tear them down. And yet, they endured. How did they do it? How did the workers, the servants, and the families living in the overcrowded tenements find the strength to keep moving forward? The answer lies in the remarkable human capacity for resilience, the ability to survive even when the odds are insurmountable. It lies in their determination, their unwavering belief that each day held the possibility of something better, even when the road ahead seemed too steep to climb. It lies in the simple, quiet acts of kindness that helped them weather the storm. In the face of oppressive working conditions, the people of Victorian London began to organize. The labor movements, though initially small and fragile, grew stronger over time as workers from all walks of life united for better wages and safer working conditions. They may not have been able to change the world overnight, but they demanded the right to dignity and respect in the workplace. Through strikes and collective action, the workers of London made it clear that they would not be silenced. It wasn't just about better pay. It was about their right to exist as more than just cogs in a machine. They fought for their humanity, and in doing so, they began to change the course of their own futures. At the same time, the people of London began to form their own networks of support. Despite the crushing weight of their own burdens, many sought ways to help one another to make life just a little more bearable for those who had nothing. Charities began to rise from the very communities that were most impoverished. The idea of mutual aid spread among the poorest neighborhoods. Families who often had nothing more than a few coins to their name would share what little they had. If a neighbor fell ill and could no longer work, others would step in offering food, firewood, or whatever they could spare. This solidarity was a lifeline for many, a quiet but powerful force that kept the city's heart beating. The people of Victorian London understood that survival was not a solitary endeavor. They could not endure alone. They had to come together to form a web of support that would catch them when they stumbled. In these small acts of kindness, the resilience of the human spirit became apparent. Even in the bleakest moments when the weight of the world seemed unbearable, people found ways to offer each other compassion. A cup of tea shared between neighbors, a loaf of bread passed from one hand to the next. These were the gestures that made survival bearable. They were small, quiet acts, but in a world so harsh, they were lifelines. The working class did not have the luxury of comfort or ease, but they had each other. And in that, they found strength. The persistence of hope was perhaps the greatest gift the people of Victorian London carried with them. It was not hope in the grand sense hope for a utopian future, but hope in the smallest of things. Hope that tomorrow would be a better day. Hope that the next strike, the next push for better wages would bring some measure of change. Hope that their children might know a life with more opportunities, a life free from the suffocating grip of poverty. It was this hope that kept them moving forward, that kept them waking each morning to face another round of factory floors, dark alleys, and treacherous streets. Hope, too, was sustained in the quiet moments, the shared laughter between friends, the joy of a family gathered around a simple meal, the feeling of warmth from a crackling fire in the hearth. These moments may have been fleeting, but they were enough. They were enough to remind the people of Victorian London that they were not mere victims of circumstance, but active participants in their own lives. They were not defined by the misery around them, but by their ability to endure and to find joy in the smallest of things. Even as the city expanded, as the factories grew taller and the soot grew thicker, the spirit of the people remained unbroken. They endured the worst of conditions, the poverty, the disease, the violence, and yet they refused to let it crush their spirits. They fought for something better. They fought for a future that would be kinder, more just. And they fought for each other, knowing that their collective strength was their greatest weapon. But let us not forget that these stories are not just confined to the past. The struggles of Victorian London echo in the present day, reminding us of the importance of resilience, community, and hope. Though our world has changed in many ways, the fundamental human need to survive and to improve our lives remains the same. As we look at our own world today, with its own challenges, let us remember the lessons of Victorian London. Let us remember the strength of those who fought against the odds, who faced seemingly insurmountable hardships and still found ways to move forward. Let us draw inspiration from their perseverance and their unshakable belief that a better life, however distant, is worth striving for. And so, as we bid farewell to the world of Victorian London, let us carry with us the memory of its people, the workers, the families, the poor souls who lived and died beneath the smog-filled skies. Their resilience, their kindness, and their unwavering hope are not just a testament to a bygone era, but a call to action for all of us. For in every struggle, in every hardship, there is the possibility of change. And it is through our own collective efforts, our own small acts of kindness, that we too can find the strength to keep moving forward. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, I invite you to share your thoughts with me. What part of the story of Victorian London spoke to you most? What lessons can we take from their resilience and apply to our own lives? Please leave a comment, share this with others who might appreciate this reflection. And if you haven't already, please subscribe for more stories from the past. Let us remember and honor those who came before us, for it is through understanding their struggles that we can better shape our own future. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the dark streets of London. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never lose hope.